theory and the practical classroom, threshold concepts, and information literacy instruction. We have Lori Townsend and Sylvia Lynn-Hannick with us today, and we are going to spend about an hour presenting and talking, and then there's going to be 30 minutes afterwards for conversation. So this is a 90-minute webinar, and I believe it will be recorded. Thank you so much, Elois, for doing that for us. Elois Sharp at ACRL. We really appreciate your support in getting this to everyone. This is just great. So I'm Miranda Hensley. I am the current chair of the Student Learning and Information Literacy Committee, and that is one of the 3 ACRL strategic planning committees. The other 2 are the Value of Academic Libraries and the Research and Scholarly Environment Committee. And one of the things that we've been working on in the Student Learning Committee is supporting the work of Sharon Mader, who is the Visiting Program Officer for ACRL, as part of the framework, and she also has the Framework Advisory Board of folks that are helping her implement the framework. And so one of the things we talked about is how can we support, they call themselves FAB, which I think is a really the best committee name ever, FAB, and how can student learning support the work that they're doing. So we're going to be doing a webinar today on threshold concepts and talking about that within our discipline, and then we will be talking about threshold concepts within other disciplines in the spring. So we hope you'll join us for that session as well. So I'd like to go ahead and introduce Lori Townsend and Sylvia Lynn-Hannick in just a second here, but I would like to thank the members of the Student Learning and Information Literacy Committee, including Elizabeth Furman and her committee members in getting this webinar together. We have a large committee, so I really appreciate all the hard work that they're doing to get information out to the rest of the ACRL community. So Lori Townsend is the Learning Services Coordinator and Engineering Librarian at the University of New Mexico, and she also served with me on the task force that wrote the framework. She received her MLS at San Jose State and her Bachelor of Arts in History, also from the University of New Mexico. She's taught information literacy for a decade now, and prior to joining UNM, she was the Electronic Collections Librarian at California State University East Bay. And I know Sylvia Lynn-Hannick because she was a graduate student here at the U of I. She's now the first experienced librarian and assistant professor at LaGuardia Community College, which is a CUNY institution. And she received her MLS here at the U of I. Sylvia, you're going to have to help me out here because I don't remember what year it was.
2009?
2009, so it wasn't too long ago. And she got her master's in English literature from the University of New Mexico. And prior to being at a CUNY institution, she worked with Lori at UNM as the Access Services Librarian. So I'm going to sign off here, and I'm going to monitor the chat, but I'm going to let Lori and Sylvia speak with you for the next hour and a half. So take it away. Thank you for being here, you guys. This is so great.
We're really happy to be here, and we're going to turn off our cameras while we're giving the presentation, and then we're going to turn them back on when we're answering questions. And if you have any questions, just put it in the chat, and hopefully one of us will catch it. Can everybody hear me okay? So thank you for inviting us to speak. Thank you, Miranda and ACRL. We are going to talk about threshold concepts in information literacy today. We've been writing and talking and thinking about this for a number of years, and we've been joined in our efforts by Amy Hoffer, who is at the Lynn Benton Community College System in Oregon, and Corey Brunetti, who is currently at the Desert Regional Medical Center in Palm Springs. So today, we are going to start with an overview of threshold concepts and how they might be used in information literacy, pause to reflect briefly on threshold concepts in the liberal arts, and then spend some time on recent controversies about threshold concepts for information literacy, and wrap up with some practical ideas for incorporating threshold concepts into your teaching practice. So threshold concepts theory entered the conversation for librarians in higher education because the Association of College and Research Libraries Task Force for Information Literacy decided to use threshold concepts to inform the new framework for information literacy. And because threshold concepts are emerging theory, we're still grappling with unresolved questions that we would love to hear your opinions about. So we wanted to start by getting a sense of where folks are and how they're feeling about threshold concepts and the framework. So we've set up a poll everywhere, and I'm going to share. Okay. I'm going to share my Firefox. So the URL for this is pollev.com/scholarly. So if you are able to open a browser and go to that URL, what we'd love you to answer the question, which is, when I think of threshold concepts or the new ACRL framework for information literacy, you fill in 1 or 2 words. And can everybody see that? Oh, yay, so people can see it. Good. And we were just hoping to get a sense of where folks were, and also, wow. So that we all know that we're sharing some feelings of, yes, confusion. Let me see if I can turn this into a word cloud. Okay, so the biggest word is overwhelmed. Yeah, the poll has Max. Sorry about that. We don't have the professional thing. So thank you for those of you, the first 40 who got it into the box. Thank you for doing that. I can see that we've got a mixture: overwhelmed, confused, inspired, excited. So we're definitely, I think, feeling a mix of things. And that's, I think we just wanted to share that because we wanted to share that all of us are kind of in this space together where we can be a little bit excited, but also maybe confused and feeling like this is a little bit too much. And so hopefully today we will be able to help maybe some of the confusion and overwhelmed feelings, fingers crossed. Okay, so I'm going to go back to frustrated. Yes, you can put it in the chat box too, actually. Thank you, everybody. Let me get back to the webinar. So are we back at the slide now?
Yes, you look good.
Okay, good. Thank you. So thank you for participating in that, and we can send that out after the presentation as part of the slideshow. So we are definitely going to talk about explaining threshold concepts today. Thank you. So before we get into that theory, let's take a second and think about why concepts are important for skills mastery. And we're going to go back to Wiggins and McTeague from their classic book, Understanding by Design. And I'll give you a second to read this. So we see threshold concepts as one way of getting at these core concepts. This way of seeing our content stands in contrast to viewing it solely as a set of skills to master. And I think this is where some folks might suspect that threshold concepts are just an attempt to make what we teach sound fancier or more complex than it actually is. Some might see what we teach students as relatively straightforward. And when we do bibliographic instruction, students get what they need, if not a complete understanding of how to use the library to find information, at minimum, a friendly face, a warm feeling about the library, and an understanding that we're here to help. The landscape, however, has shifted, and information no longer lives mostly in the library. So it's out there roaming the wilds of the internet. Self-published novels sit next to authoritative blog entries from the New York Times, and nature sits next to questionable academic journals produced by pharmaceutical companies. So in this environment, how does the novice distinguish between bad and good information, or even just relevant and irrelevant? So we as librarians have to venture beyond the library and into the concepts that make sense of information systems outside of it, in the world where finding, using, and creating information happens. Threshold concepts are the core ideas and processes. core ideas and processes in any discipline that define the discipline, but are so ingrained that they often go unspoken or unrecognized by practitioners. They are the central concepts that we want our students to understand and put into practice, that encourage them to think and act like practitioners, biologists, economists, and so on. Threshold concepts are the ones that are often most difficult to grasp, but that a student needs in order to progress in his or her learning. There are 5 definitional criteria that make a concept a threshold concept. And I know those of you who have spent some time with the framework or with threshold concepts are familiar with this, but we generally start just in case there's some folks who need a little bit of grounding. So the first and most important criteria is that threshold concepts are transformative. They cause the student to see the class material and the discipline and maybe him or herself and the rest of the world in a different way. This perceptual shift can transform the students. Students see the content through the lens of the practitioner community and adopt the ways of thinking and practicing common to the discipline. Threshold concepts are irreversible. Once you learn them, you don't unlearn them. For example, once you see the rabbit and the duck, you cannot not see both. Threshold concepts are irreversible in the same way. For us, this is a way of explaining why we as teachers sometimes have trouble relating to where our students are, because we've been on the other side of the threshold for so long that it's difficult for us to remember what it was like before we got it. This is one of the reasons why it can actually be difficult to identify threshold concepts. Threshold concepts are integrative. Grasping a threshold concept helps the student tie together all of the facts and procedural information and make connections that allow them to see the whole. This may also allow them to apply a new understanding to other areas. Threshold concepts may be bounded. This is an interesting one because information literacy is not a discipline. Well, I don't think we consider it a discipline, but I know some have argued over this. But librarians share a common way of thinking and practicing that we acquire by crossing thresholds of our discipline, information science. So finally, threshold concepts are often troublesome. This trouble can come in different varieties, but it tends to center around the fact. Is there a problem with the sound? It tends to center around the fact that we're talking about big transformative concepts that can provoke student anxiety and resistance. So Meyer and Rand spend a lot of ink on the idea of liminality and the liminal space. They define it as a space where the threshold comes into view for the learner, but the learner has not yet passed through it. And this liminal space is an in-between transitional place, and it can be exciting and terrifying and also engaging or troubling. One thing it isn't typically is comfortable. Learners move through the liminal space in different ways and at different speeds, but they will presumably not leave the space unchanged. And learners emerge from the liminal space changed in 2 broad ways. So there's this epistemological change, which is the cognitive shift, which is the extent to which the student understands the new concept. And then there's the ontological change, which is the shift in identity that a student experiences as they get an inkling of what it's like to look through a particular disciplinary lens. We're talking about the extent to which a student feels comfortable saying, I'm a biologist, or I research like a librarian. This means that threshold concepts are both cognitive and affective, and hence the fraught nature of the liminal space. It's both an intellectual and an emotional experience. So threshold concepts treat students as potential disciplinary practitioners. In teaching with threshold concepts, we ask students to try seeing the world through our disciplinary lens. Making this explicit can address some of the traditional power imbalances that often arise in educational settings. We are not insisting that one or another perspective is better or right, but introducing the idea that this is how librarians see information. Try it on for size. They can decide on their own whether or not they want to adopt this lens. So what are the threshold concepts for information literacy? Well, we conducted a Delphi study to answer this question, and a shortened version of this answer is available at this URL. There's a handout there. The goal of the Delphi study was to identify threshold concepts for information literacy, these big ideas that meet all or most of the criteria that are set forth by Meyer and Rand. However, the goal was not necessarily to identify all of the threshold concepts for information literacy, and in fact, I personally think there are more. We don't have a slide with the threshold concepts. They're fairly similar to the frames, although there are some differences. So I definitely recommend taking a visit to that particular URL. So if this sounds a bit squishy, well, reading the threshold concepts literature, we can expect that researchers and instructors may arrive at differing or complementary conclusions about the threshold concepts in any given field. So there are librarians who view information literacy as a threshold concept. We like to think about multiple learning thresholds within the bounds of information literacy, and a number of librarians, Margaret Blackmore and Virginia Tucker, our Delphi panelists, and the Framework Task Force have come up with somewhat different lists of threshold concepts for information literacy, and the list resulting from our Delphi study is not the definitive list, nor is the framework. We definitely encourage folks to modify and extend on this work, to customize it for their students, and we do feel confident, however, that our list describes 6 big ideas that underlie the content that we teach. And we think that these threshold concepts can help a novice view information through a librarian lens. So a useful understanding of a group of disciplinary threshold concepts is one that I first heard articulated by Craig Gibson, who was one of the co-chairs of the ACRL Information Literacy Framework Task Force. And he said that our content was a network of interconnected understandings. And you might pass through the liminal space on one, and maybe it helps you along in another. And that is to say that this is complex, integrative material, and you can't necessarily teach it in a step-by-step linear fashion. Likewise, students often get stuck in a liminal space because such complexity is difficult, and yet dumbing it down or simplifying it doesn't help them move through the threshold. That said, our students also need to learn the procedural skills that we have traditionally taught through bibliographic instruction. I think that kind of teaching is compatible with the threshold concept approach. Now I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about one threshold concept as an example of how this approach might shift the way we tend to think of a common information literacy topic, and that's the research process. So, how have librarians conceptualized the research process? In a lot of ways, the research process sits at the heart of how we think about information literacy. Early information literacy models almost always started with a research process of some sort, and from there we developed our current model of information literacy, the standards: defining an information need, accessing needed information, evaluating information, and using information. An early advance in thinking about the research process was Kuhlbau's work studying K-12 students as they moved through a relatively linear, if iterative, process. The outstanding insight in her work was charting the effective processes that students were feeling alongside the thinking they did. This work, done in the late 80s, laid the foundation for later research process models. And one of the things that I like about Kuhlbau's work is that it's fairly abstract. The different stages aren't necessarily practical, like here's where we find encyclopedias, but they describe a progression in more general terms. But as a general rule, we're a practical profession. We like to make things useful for our students. And so lots of practical and abstract models of the research process have proliferated over the years. Over time, these models have been adopted by academic libraries as a kind of advice we give our students in classes and on our websites. So a brief, non-scientific, and wholly random survey of academic library websites says a lot about how we tend to define the research process for our students and how we communicate it to them. It's usually delineated as a series of steps, iterative but orderly. So I'm going to go through a few of these, and this is probably one of the most basic: develop a topic, locate information, evaluate and analyze, write, cite. And this pretty closely maps to the ACRL standards for information literacy. So we also have a little bit more writing focused. So you can see that they're actually paying a little bit more attention in this one to a student who is writing a paper, write a thesis, make an outline, take notes. This next one has a little bit more detail about the searching process for information preliminary, evaluating sources, make notes. There's only one step that really talks about writing, although they do include proofreading, which I love. So this one is a little bit more abstract. Notice that they say to read, which I love because, yes, you have to read in order to do your research. But we've got these sort of more conceptual notions: explore, propose, develop, validate. So, and finally, this is a research process that is from Mary George's book, Elements of Library Research. And this actually incorporates some effective and even more abstract concepts, a little bit less concrete, like insight based on reflection, imagination. And aside from this last one, I don't actually see a whole lot of Kuhlthau's groundbreaking work reflected in the processes. Even her work denotes this sort of orderly step-by-step process, and I think a lot of us and our students really crave this kind of concrete guidance. This process laid out in 5 or 7 or 9 steps sort of seems to promise an orderly progression for research towards this final successful outcome. But it might hide the reality a little bit. So in recent years, Ithaca S&R has published a series of research reports about the methods of various types of researchers, from chemists to historians. And librarians were actually doing this work throughout the 20th century, but there has been a renewed interest because of the influx of new digital tools and that changing information landscape. And so related work is also being done about graduate students and the transition from student to independent scholar. How does a student move from being an extremely effective consumer of information to a producer of information? So we're going to take a look at some broad findings from some of this work. But before we get to that, I want to take us back to Kuhlthau for a minute, because I'm going to make a point that is a serious oversimplification, and even though I think it's meaningful, it's probably unfair and not really the whole picture. But Kuhlthau developed her model of the research process based on several studies of the habits of high school students, which has always seemed ordinary enough to me when I read her work back in library school, and more recently when I've been researching a chapter on the research process. But thinking about it in the light of work done by Nancy Free Foster at Ithaca and others, I realized that a research process developed from the habits of novice researchers might not quite be what I want my students to emulate. I might want to learn more about the habits of expert researchers and develop my understanding of the research process from their practice. And in fact, this novice-expert contrast is one of the central features of the threshold concepts model. So given that fact, what do expert researchers say about their research process? First, research is messy. It is not linear. Scholars certainly use known pathways and disciplinary techniques in a broadly purposeful manner. However, as prolific sociologist Andrew Abbott says in his book Digital Paper, I love the great confusion to jumping to clear and important piece of research. He also says this. In his book, Abbott outlines a research process that is only orderly once it's written up for a journal article or book. So second, when asked, researchers often have difficulty describing their research process. Cravens and colleagues conducted a qualitative study of a group of highly successful researchers. When asked about their process, these researchers struggled to answer. This suggests that much of how expert researchers understand the research process is tacit or hidden knowledge, a form of troublesome knowledge that can cause students to stumble or get stuck. So this professor does it probably how most people do it. I don't think there's any special magic there. So this might be why some of our faculty have difficulty teaching research to students. They see their own habits of mind as almost magical, even if not a special magic, but maybe they can't quite articulate what it is that they're doing. And this leads me to the next point. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Kuhlthau was so very right about affect. Expert researchers describe a process fraught with risk, stuck places, and puzzles. They talk about creativity, innovation, and insight. To quote Craven et al. Again, the expert researchers were comfortable with ambiguity and risk, viewing it as a normal part of the process of producing original research. And even more importantly, as far as our students are concerned, do not view periods of not knowing what to do next as evidence of personal deficiency. And the researchers emphasize the importance of creativity again and again. So creativity throughout. The core, you formulate your questions using creativity. It helps you with your interpreting your findings and applying those findings. Creativity is important. So we see that experts do not follow a series of discrete, tidy steps when conducting research. The advice we librarians give is based on what sounds like a good idea, but much of it doesn't reflect the way research happens in the real world. And here's where I would like to think about it in terms of a metaphor that the instruction working group at UNM came up with. So the current research process articulated by the standards and similar models might be compared to putting together a piece of IKEA furniture. You've got a limited set of tools and some step-by-step instructions, and that's not to say that it's easy. There are parts that are confusing, spaces where the directions don't quite fit, moments of confusion and doubt. But if you follow the instructions carefully, you'll end up with a nice Billy bookcase. Now, compare this to building a custom bookcase. The end result is similar, though maybe of higher quality or maybe not, depending on your level of expertise. But the process is quite a contrast. To even get started, you have so many options and questions to deal with. What kind of wood are you going to use? What tools will you need? What design elements will you use? How much time will it take? Tons of little decisions and mistakes and adjustments and tools and creativity go into building a custom bookcase. Building a bookcase from scratch requires a whole host of skills performed effectively in parallel. Some parts of the process might be extremely orderly, following a given set of common standards. Other parts of the process are extremely messy and creative. However, once expertise is built, a clear goal guides the creator throughout the process, both the methodical parts and the untidy bits. So this brief meditation on the research process leads me back around to the new ACRL framework and threshold concepts. In our research, the research process is defined briefly as this. And this matches pretty well with the frame research as inquiry. And when we say knowledge, we mean in the mind. It can be personal, as in new to me, or universal, as in new to humanity. And here is the research as inquiry frame. And I think I have a longer version of it, right? And I know that folks have struggled with the framework, have felt that it was too vague, perhaps a bit wordy. However, one thing it does much better than many of our older models is make an attempt at articulating a research process as it is done by expert researchers in the real world. It encourages and challenges us to regard our students as scholars, to excite their creativity and curiosity, to encourage them to accept the chaos and uncertainty. I think all of our models contain helpful elements. Though I would ask, and I really don't have the answer to this question, do any of our most commonly used models give us a solid sense of how to guide our students in moving from novice to expert researchers? So this is one example of how the framework and threshold concepts might ask us to reconsider common practices in information literacy. And this particular example, tied as it is to so many other disciplines, brings me to the next section of our talk. What are other disciplines doing with threshold concepts? And this is a very short bit. So I'm going to look at threshold concepts in the liberal arts and how this might connect to information literacy instruction. First, threshold concepts have been widely embraced by faculty across the disciplines as a way to re-engage with disciplinary content and as a model for selecting content based on what we know about how teaching and learning works. Threshold concepts offer faculty a set of criteria that they can use to re-see their content from the perspective of the novice or beginner. They encourage reflective teaching, which I think is something that we all can agree is a valuable perspective. However, there are variations in how different disciplines have engaged with threshold concepts. Most of the early work on threshold concepts was done in disciplines like engineering, biology, computer science, and accounting. These disciplines often seek correct or right answers and thus have an easier time embracing the novice-expert divide and the sense that students must be brought through a series of thresholds to master a given field of knowledge. The so-called soft disciplines or low consensus disciplines have engaged more slowly. A question often asked is whose threshold concepts? And humanists hesitate to further reinforce troubling power dynamics already at play in the classroom. Do we honor the knowledge that students bring with them? Are we imposing our own values and perspectives on our students? These questions trouble many and some have been a little bit wary to embrace threshold concepts. However, some humanists have chosen to give threshold concepts a try, and I'm going to talk about a couple of examples. Joy McEntee at the University of Adelaide in Australia teaches a course on Hollywood film, which she describes as sitting at the intersection between film studies and literary studies. In her course, she asks students who usually come to the course as big movie fans to look again and differently at cultural phenomena they think they already know. She asks them to cultivate the kind of analytic detachment employed by scholars and critics when watching movies. She thinks threshold concepts help explain the fear and resistance her students exhibit as they face the loss of innocent enjoyment of movies. She also shares some criticisms of threshold concepts. Remember the lens metaphor I used earlier, where I compared passing through the threshold to looking through a disciplinary lens? Well, Meyer and Land posit that threshold concepts are irreversible. But McEntee contends that threshold concepts aren't so much irreversible in the sense that students can't go back to their old ways of seeing the world, but that students may adopt a kind of double vision, where they put the lens on when they want or need it and take it off when they don't. Her students can watch movies with an analytical eye and for simple enjoyment. And as she says, lifelong students of film don't cross thresholds so much as loiter in them. And she thinks going back and forth between these perspectives is the end point of the transformative process. Adler, Kastner, Majewski, and Koschnick studied threshold concepts in the general education curriculum, particularly through the examination of two classes, English composition and U.S. history. They looked for shared threshold concepts in the hope that these would facilitate transfer of understanding to other areas. For example, in their classes, they seek to emphasize the importance of multiple narratives in both history, where there is no single correct narrative, and in writing, where they want students to develop their own narrative voice. Context is critical in examining both historical evidence and in writing. Who is writing or analyzing historical evidence? Why are they doing so? Who is the audience and what does that audience expect? I find their work particularly relevant to our work with students in information literacy. First, we often focus our efforts on the first-year experience of students when they are passing critical developmental milestones that set the stage for success as independent adults. Second, genre, as articulated in genre theory, is very similar to the format threshold concept and certainly touches on the authority threshold concept as well. I've always thought that format was one of the best places to start with students because I think it brings together many of the elements around the critical evaluation of sources: process, purposes, dissemination, use. Why is something made? Who made it? How can I tell that it's worthwhile? How do I know what to trust? And by explicitly seeking shared threshold concepts, Adler, Kastner, et al. Are challenging the bounded criterion and endorsing a view that allows for interdisciplinary threshold concepts. So both of these examples call into question Meyer and Land's proposed threshold concepts criteria and show the way that threshold concepts have been adapted by other disciplines in spite of sometimes problematic issues. So speaking of problematic, how about that recent controversy surrounding threshold concepts in information literacy? For that, I'm going to pass the ball to Sylvia.
Okay, so if you spent any part of the last year in instruction librarian circles, you probably already know that there was a lot of debate about the ACRL standards for information literacy versus the more nebulous sounding ACRL framework. As one of the theories that inform the framework, threshold concepts have also come up against some scrutiny. So the initial charge of the ACRL standards for information literacy revision task force was to, quote, update the information literacy competency standards for higher education so that they reflect the current thinking on such things as the creation and dissemination of knowledge, the changing global higher education and learning environment, the shift from information literacy to information fluency, and the expanding definition of information literacy to include multiple literacies like transliteracy, media literacy, digital literacy, etc., unquote. So that's it, only that. However, the task force created an entirely new framework, which is comprised of 6 frames. Each frame represents a big understanding. But the frames go beyond the big understanding to lay out knowledge practices and dispositions for each understanding. The knowledge practices are the ways that students can demonstrate their understanding of a topic. They are the specific things we want students to be able to do or understand related to the big idea. I think it's understood that you may identify more knowledge practices for a given frame, depending on the priorities you have set in your local context. The dispositions represent the affective side of the big idea. How should a student best approach a particular understanding? What attitudes or habits of mind best support learning? Full disclosure, as previously mentioned, Lori was a member of the task force, and all of us are inclined to view the framework in a positive light. This structure strikes us as flexible, and we like the focus on big ideas or conceptual understandings. We love the addition of dispositions because we all know that our students bring more to college with them than just their brains. However, the framework caused quite an uproar in the United States and even reached Europe when a prominent information literacy educator lambasted it at the European Conference on Information Literacy. Threshold concepts generated their own additional conversations, and LILAC even invited Ray Land as a keynote speaker to its annual conference. Change is hard, and we all know how much academia loves change. Many, but certainly not all, of the chief concerns with the framework were expressed in an open letter circulated by New Jersey academic librarians that outlined criticisms and recommendations. Here are a few. It is tone deaf to the politics of higher education. We finally got accrediting bodies to acknowledge and incorporate the existing standards, so changing them will risk these important gains. The framework is a theoretical document which makes it difficult to assess outcomes. Assessment continues to be an integral part of higher education. It's too jargony in terms of the education and psychology terms that it brings in, and it's too theoretical. Not surprisingly, given their influence on the new framework, threshold concepts theory has been contentious. In a recent talk at LOX, Lane Wilkinson summarized some of the chief criticisms. We can't address all of them in this talk, but I will mention some of what we see as the more important ones and offer an alternative read. So one criticism is how fuzzy the criteria might be. Meyer and Land deliberately use language that is hedging, like threshold concepts may be troublesome, might integrate disparate concepts. Some critics take this to mean that almost anything can be called a threshold concept. But a careful read of the threshold concept literature makes it clear that the criteria are fairly rigorous. Meyer and Land's careful language is likely intended to avoid ruling out something as a threshold concept if it doesn't meet a particular criteria. So I'm going to use a fuzzy example to illustrate this. Do all cats need tails? What about fur? And really, this guy has almost no ears at all. They probably all feel about this self-satisfied though. But what we can recognize is that every single one of these adorable creatures are definitely cats. We can recognize a threshold concept or a big idea as such, even if it doesn't quite fit every single one of the criteria. And this is especially important for interdisciplinary fields of inquiry like library and information science. Another criticism is that threshold concepts are unproven, or at least there's a severe lack of empirical research to support their effectiveness. That's true to a point. Although some disciplines have used them to great effect, threshold concepts research is still emerging in our field, and there's a lot of work to be done. Now that our Delphi study is complete, Lori, Amy, and I are delving even deeper into our understanding of individual concepts by writing a book with an intended audience of both practicing librarians and library school students. Other librarians, like Megan Oakley, are writing on threshold concept assessment or using threshold concepts in specific teaching situations. But we also have to ask, how much of what librarians do in the classroom is supported by positivist proof? I don't need a 10-year double-blind study to know that the activities I'm sharing today work in our classrooms. I know it works because students who came in slouching and checking their email are paying attention, sitting up straight and asking their own questions. This is also a form of evidence. Other kinds of evidence are forthcoming for threshold concepts, but that doesn't mean we can't use them right now to improve our teaching. I know that using threshold concepts has helped me engage with the content that I teach in a deeper and more meaningful way. But I also know that many librarians before me didn't need threshold concepts to engage with this content and with students in this way. Some argue that by agreeing on one set of threshold concepts for a discipline, we may ignore the diversity of human experience by setting out one uniform path to learning. Meyer and Land have written extensively, however, about the liminal state and how students will experience this in different ways. This is a key component of teaching with threshold concepts. So here's a picture that I drew to help us think about progress through a threshold concept. If we picture the threshold concept as a doorway in the distance, we should imagine the learners approaching it from all different directions. One person might have her hand on the handle. When this learner is introduced to a threshold concept for the first time, she might walk right through because she's had exposure to similar ideas, or she was given an example to which she could relate. She's already right there. Others may take twice as long because they're several blocks away from the door, or because they stopped to get a coffee. Still, others walk around in a circle for a bit, or sit down in one place for several months. Threshold concepts acknowledge that students come to us with varying levels of prior knowledge. Another criticism of threshold concepts goes something like this. Threshold concepts represent hegemonic dictates and tools of oppression. They reproduce the dominant power structures. Threshold concepts offer only one path to correct understanding and therefore are not flexible enough to accommodate a range of perspectives. This aspect of threshold concepts seems to be often misunderstood. For example, one talk at ACRL last spring echoed an objection we've often heard to information commodities. The speaker suggested that we're somehow endorsing the commodification of information by saying that information is bought and sold. I'm sure I'm oversimplifying the argument, but that's the gist as I understand it. But students hit paywalls on Google Scholar, they spend more than their tuition on textbooks, libraries exhaust their budgets buying back research that faculty conducted on university time. Information is, in fact, bought and sold, and this makes it a commodity. But making that statement doesn't mean that I endorse that that's the way the world currently works. Why would we not tell our students that these forces are in play, even if we preface it by saying, I hate that this is the way the world works, but we can teach a critical approach. We can emphasize the importance of open licensing and fair use. We can go as far as we want down the path of alternative models and radical views. You can't be critical of something in an effective way unless you have a chance to understand it first. Threshold concepts as a model doesn't force you to teach your content one way or another. They don't force you to agree with all of the implications of the discipline. What they do acknowledge is that there is a perspective, a way of looking at the world that is unique to our discipline. If we're going to make our students into little librarians, that is, help them become information literate, we should be able to articulate what that means. Our group of co-authors has mostly worked with students that are first generation, non-traditional, community college, underrepresented minorities, the ones that may encounter the greatest ontological or affected shift in higher education. We are also informed by personal experiences that are outside of the presumed norm of being a straight white male in academia. Our stance is that threshold concepts should be used to encourage students to engage critically with the content that we teach in order to assist them in defining structural expectations. As for being monolithic, we see threshold concepts as an ongoing conversation that gets us thinking about our content and our process. Your curriculum doesn't have to be identical to mine for both of them to include big ideas that challenge our students and enlarge their perspectives. Finally, some have objected that disciplinary knowledge is rarely unified and that experts disagree. This is especially true of the humanities. However, as Lori shared, work is being done by humanist scholars around the idea of threshold concepts. Even though humanists disagree on many things, I would argue that they bring a core group of understandings with them to that disagreement. There are some things that you have to get in order to have a seat at the table, to engage with a community in discourse. The same is true for librarians. We don't all teach the same content in the exact same way, but there are definitely ideas that define our area of expertise and that make their way into most library instruction classrooms. The value of a theoretical framework is immense. Working with new theories can inspire, challenge, and shift our thinking. Though this may not be true for every discipline, I would argue that our pedagogical theory is most valuable when we use it in the classroom in order to improve student learning. Threshold concepts help us organize, develop the information science content that has always belonged to us. So I want to share some of the different ways I've used threshold concepts and the framework to improve my teaching. I hope my interpretation of the theory will be useful to you, but mostly, I hope the content of my activities and assignments will feel familiar. I hope they will echo the thinking and priorities you've developed over your years as a librarian, and that they reinforce your sense of expertise as an instructor and practitioner. To give you a bit of context here, at my institution, I teach both semester-long credit courses as well as one-shot library instruction sessions. While many of my activities were developed for the credit course, they have also all been used in one-shot sessions. As we touched on previously, threshold concepts acknowledge that students come to us with varying levels of prior knowledge. Learners don't start a course in the same place, nor do they learn at the same pace. We're talking about whether they've gone through a peer revision process in their class and so can compare it to the academic peer review process, or whether they were ever in a science fair and can make the connection between a hypothesis and a thesis statement, or even if they have an internet connection at home. Threshold concepts ask them to work on getting more comfortable in the gray area. Not black, not white, which is something that many threshold concepts deal in. The gray area is complex and requires knowledge to navigate successfully. But it's in the gray area that students advance their understanding. This means that we don't discourage students from using Google or Wikipedia, or suggesting that joining Facebook means that they're selling their soul. We don't hold the library as the end-all, be-all location for good, reliable, authoritative information. Instead, we ask our students to build their expertise incrementally, moving through their information landscape critically, cautiously, and confidently. So how does this translate to instructional design? Of course, we don't have to throw out the research paper or the lab report or even the low-stakes knowledge check quiz, which all still have value. But we can also use other activities that tell us where students are. For example, we can ask learners to do a think, pair, share about a complex idea, to make a quick infographic or concept map for a theory, or carry out verbal interviews about a new concept. Here you're seeing a brainstorming session where my class practiced coming up with keywords as a part of developing their research questions. After we mapped out all of the conversations they'd had in class about feminism, we talked about the sections of the map where the topic was too broad for a research question, like feminism in general, or too narrow, like Jane's experience at St. John's University, and good topics like the wage gap or expectations about performed femininity or masculinity. This isn't an enormous change from current practice. It could be as simple as showing that they understand that not everything you find on the web is a website, or giving their own example of how two formats are different from one another, or drawing a picture of the difference between the open web and a database. Showing progress is going to look really different for everyone because our students start out with very different backgrounds and experiences. When teaching 60-minute library instruction sessions, it can be difficult to know where your students are in terms of their prior knowledge. One of our favorite tools for quickly gauging where our students are in their understanding is Poll Everywhere, an anonymous audience polling tool. Here you are seeing the responses I got from a group of first-year students. I can tell from their responses here that most of them know that peer review and scholarly journals are the right answers. The fact that this one phrase is coming up from everyone, though, tells me that I can start pushing on those answers to get at questions about authority and scholarly discourse. This is where I ask things like, what do you look for when you check your classmates' writing? And what percentage of journal articles do you think are rejected every year? I ask things like, is a Yelp review written by a food expert scholarly? And is Tylenol's CEO an expert on pain relief medicine? Is she still a good source of information if she tells you that Tylenol is the best pain relief medicine? I attempt to contextualize their answers and build on what they already know. Now we're looking at the same question posed to students in my semester-long research strategies course. Their responses tell me that most of them did the assigned reading, yay, but they have some complicated ideas about the relationship between opinion and scholarship. With this class, I called on students to define the components of authorial expertise and to separate commentary from analysis statements. I asked questions like, does the value of a source change depending on who is reading it? And what is the difference between an opinion and an argument? Anonymous polling gives us a chance to talk about where we all struggle, and it destigmatizes the experience of not getting something right away. We mentioned before that working with threshold concepts means embracing the gray area. The gray area is one of my favorite things about teaching with threshold concepts because ambiguity can be so powerful and so liberating. Ambiguity means letting go of right and wrong answers to embrace, it depends, so what, how are you going to use this, and what are you trying to prove? One assignment that comes up every so often asks students to use primary and secondary sources. Rather than treat the two categories as silos, I engage students in a conversation about why these distinctions are slippery or confusing, and why the value of information shifts depending on the question you're asking, and the means by which it was created or will be used. To do this, I give students links to 2 or 3 different sources. Recently, I used a Victorian Conduct Guide for Gentlemen, an interactive New York Times article about an avalanche, and a clip from The Daily Show from the night of the 2008 election. So then I asked them, is this a primary source, a secondary source, or both? Unsurprisingly, those responses are mixed. These responses lead into a discussion, though, about context and function. The Conduct Guide quotes from many sources, so it's secondary, but since it was published in the 1800s, it does tell us something authentic about Victorian standards for proper behavior, so it's also a primary source. When Jon Stewart shows clips from Fox News or CNN, he's quoting like we would in a research paper, which is what secondary sources do. If we were using this clip in 2008, it might be a secondary source. But if you use it right now, today, and take into account the immediacy of Jon Stewart's reaction to the 2008 election, you could use it as a primary source. This exercise touches on the format threshold concept because it asks students to evaluate a source based not on the way that it is presented, but the way that it was created and how it will be used. It also gets at the research process threshold concept because we focus on the different questions that primary and secondary sources answer and how those answers contribute to knowledge creation. The research process threshold concept stems up in this next activity too. This threshold concept acknowledges that identifying and articulating useful questions requires an existing foundation of knowledge and is difficult intellectual work. However, when a student asks a question, connections are made, and the process from inquiry to seeking out existing knowledge, to the selection of relevant information, to the development and testing of a thesis, and subsequent analysis and synthesis of the results is the same one that experts engage with in the creation of new knowledge. To unpack this concept, I asked students to do a little bit of reverse engineering. We start by watching a recent viral video commissioned by Hollaback, an anti-street harassment organization. In the first frames of the 1-minute and 57-second video, subtitles indicate that the video was shot over the course of 10 hours as a woman was filmed walking through the streets of New York City. In less than 2 minutes, we watch as the woman is followed, propositioned, and harassed. After the video ends, I ask students 2 questions. The first one is, what do you think the makers of this video used as their research question? Here are some of their answers. Then I asked, what racial patterns do you see in the video? Next, I show students excerpts from a blog entry analyzing the video. Despite purporting to represent a walk all over New York City, 59% of the interactions that made it into the short video took place in Harlem. And, as many of the students pointed out, only men of color are shown harassing the women. In fact, the filmmaker later admitted to editing out the Caucasian men captured on film for various reasons, like unclear audio. We talk about whether the filmmaker was justified in his decisions and whether the criticisms of the video were fair. I asked students to share their own experiences with street harassment in New York City, and then I bring it back to their assignment by showing their answers to the first question about research questions. Having a good research question is key, I argue, and all of these were good research questions. But if your evidence is flawed, skewed, or biased, you will weaken your argument. The activities that I've shared today have been great for individual instruction sessions where the disciplinary faculty have been open to experimentation and lend themselves to the same kind of informal assessment we've always done in bibliographic instruction. I watch student reactions, I build in time to work with students one-on-one, and I listen carefully to the questions being asked or not asked. Lori will talk, though, about how she's trying to take the threshold concept approach to a programmatic level.
Okay, so before I start talking about how we're using threshold concepts in our instruction program, I'm going to pause for a second to talk about assessment. So I think assessment of threshold concepts or the new framework has been a pretty scary issue for a lot of us. I, however, am going to argue that they don't necessarily change assessment in a big way. As you heard, Sylvia has built in assessment to many of her learning activities. And on that level where we work as teachers designing assessments and learning objects, assessment remains the same. However, I think folks have been focusing on trying to assess the crossing of thresholds, which can be very difficult. So no wonder we're nervous about it. I think this issue goes back to the problem of assessment in education more broadly. It's hard to say exactly how a student would demonstrate some kinds of understandings and learning. To use an example from sociology, how do we assess that a student understands the sociological concept of privilege with regards to race, gender, disability, and so on? Such an understanding requires a personal transformation in addition to a cognitive one. Likely it cannot be assessed using a multiple choice test. So complex skills and understandings require nuanced assessment techniques, if they can be assessed at all, and perhaps can't be encompassed by a concrete set of learning objectives and the linear path to learning such objectives tend to imply. That's not to say we can't use learning objectives to guide and assess our day-to-day instruction. if we think of learning as a journey, we can decide on markers and measure some kind of progress towards those markers. However, some progress requires leaps of understanding, insights, and transformation, and students often find their own paths. So how do we measure such things? For me, it's okay to admit that we can assess some learning usefully, but maybe not some of the most important stuff. And I think this is what we will continue to do, threshold concepts or no. But I tend to think less of assessing threshold concepts directly and more of using them to guide my choice of instructional content. They give me yet another tool to think about what I'm teaching. So this is what I call curriculum mapping, but I think others might refer to it by different names. This is one way of organizing what we think our students should be learning or what we want to cover in our information literacy program by 3 basic categories: searching and finding, choosing, evaluating, and using. There's another way that we organize this by threshold concept. So the content hasn't changed, and we actually started with the threshold concepts, but then we tried using the other searching, choosing, and using categories because it was helpful to use both models when brainstorming. And of course, this was developed by a group of librarians familiar with threshold concepts and the new framework, and it's still very rough, with a bias towards social sciences and no category for professional or graduate programs, which was pointed out by our business librarian. We do hope that liaison librarians will be able to use a more complete version of this map to customize their curriculums for the academic departments they work with. And we've got a fair ways to go yet, but it gives us a chance to think about what we are teaching students and when and how we can get there. And right now we have an upper division credit course on the books and a lower division course that's making its way through the curriculum approval process. Library credit courses have a long history at UNM, and our current administration is very supportive of us pursuing this path, but I understand that that's not the case for everyone. So another aspect of sort of curriculum mapping, or what I call curriculum mapping, we are doing relates to our first year instruction program and one-shots. Like a lot of you, I'm sure, we teach a ton of the single session workshops for first year classes. And we used to teach these largely based on the individual instructor working with the individual librarian to help students with a specific assignment. However, this resulted in some students receiving the same basic workshop several times. And since we cannot guarantee that all students will take all of these classes, we also cannot construct any kind of sequential program that builds on previous work. But we have established some big goals for our instruction program, as you see here: warm welcome, introduction to library resources, some help with selection. We see those goals as broadly supported by these threshold concepts. In the first year, we want to give students an introduction to authority, which at this level mostly concerns authorship, and format, which we feel like we have to do because they mostly see the world in terms of websites or print with very vague notions of other formats. Information structures, which is a threshold concept, well, it's what we call a threshold concept, deals with the way information is organized into databases and other information systems. And we need to teach students how to retrieve information from library systems of information. We can start with a few good tools like Academic Search Complete or Points of View. And the last, and maybe the most important bit, is the warm welcome. And this is where we hope students begin to understand the value of the academic library and engage with it. And I kind of call this the library as the commodity-free zone. And by this, I simply mean that we're seeing the library as a place of intellectual freedom where we, the library, have no ulterior motive in offering information to individuals beyond hoping that they will learn from it and enjoy it. And really, how many other organizations that one encounters in the world can say the same? And, of course, we want to help. So how does this play out in the classroom? So the bulk of our classes tend to come in certain flavors. English 120, which is kind of just, English 1A, so the requirement that all students have to take this course. University 101, 102, which are transitional courses from high school to college. And then CJ 130, which is our public speaking class. So we started to focus each type of class on a threshold concept. We use in-class activities that relate to those threshold concepts and the assignment for the class at hand, so both threshold concepts and the assignment. We still teach about using databases, but we are working on getting most of our first year program flipped so that the initial database work comes before the class and we can focus on other concepts during the class using active learning exercises that build on flipped content in addition to hands-on time with databases. So this way students are covering conceptual content from different angles in multiple classes and getting help with their assignments. And does this system function perfectly? No, but we're working on improving it each semester. And we make heavy use of threshold concepts in thinking about our content and choosing where to focus our efforts. But I personally don't believe we can teach all of this content using one-shots. I think we need more time with our students. Thresholds take time to cross. 50 minutes may not even be enough time to bring the threshold into view. Librarians are subject matter experts with big ideas to teach. And if you really want to work with your students on advancing their conceptual understanding of information, you need time. There's no substitute for time on task. When you have a credit course and the ability to assign homework attached to a grade, that acts as a powerful motivator for students to engage with the content. And a lot of what I've heard about the framework lately encourages librarians to take incremental steps and to notice that they are already doing this kind of teaching. And I totally agree with this perspective. However, I also think we can be ambitious and admit that perhaps the most effective way we can help students cross thresholds in a meaningful way is with more time.
When I was first introduced to threshold concepts, I was completely overwhelmed by how much it raised the stakes, and that's a little bit of what we've heard here today too. I know that I had a difficult enough time covering library services and resources in an hour, and now I'm supposed to teach students to interrogate the contextual underpinnings of their information world. It's a lot. As I've worked with the theory, though, I found that engaging with threshold concepts is less about trying to teach 6 complex concepts in one class and more about shifting my priorities. My objective was moving from help students find articles that take a pro-con stance on a current event to frame topic development as the first step in a research process in which inquiry leads to the creation of new knowledge. Still, a shift towards conceptual teaching doesn't mean that all 20 students cross the threshold in 1 hour. Instead, I use that hour to invite students to approach, if not cross, the threshold. When I get near a new concept with a student, I remind myself that I'm planting a seed, I'm introducing the threshold, maybe helping it come into view, and we're going to circle back over many times until that student does cross through and have a aha moment. This is also true when it comes to our colleagues. Our advice for today is to take the seeds we've shared and plant them with the librarians at your institution. Form a community of practice and think through things together. Stay critical, stay skeptical, and ask difficult questions. Reflective teaching is definitely something that we have to do together. Our particular group of co-authors is proof that it can be done across institutions with very different academic missions. We do believe that there's tons of room for everybody here, and we want to invite all of you to be co-investigators as we work to continue developing this emerging theory. And now we'd like to open up for some questions.
Thank you, Lori and Sylvia, for an excellent presentation. This is Miranda Hensley again. I just wanted to clarify, and maybe Sylvia and Lori, you want to speak to this, that the frames and the framework are different than the research that you guys are doing on threshold concepts, and that they aren't totally aligned, but that we use some of the data from the framework. Lori, maybe you want to speak to that a bit?
Yeah, sure. So I was kicking myself for not including a list of the threshold concepts that came out of the Delphi study in the slide deck because they are different from the framework. And I think let's see, there are 6 of them. They're very closely related, but we have, instead of information has value, we have information commodities, format, authority, which are format is the information creation of the process, authority, Sylvia, help me out here, what else is there? I know I should just know them all off the top of my head. Information structures. Oh, she's pulling out a
yeah, I'm trying. So the 6 that we are using are authority, format, information commodities, information structures, research process, and scholarly discourse.
Right. And so the framework took the approach of stating things as sentences, and we just took the approach of just labeling them as sort of individual concepts, and there are some differences. The information as a commodity, what it used to be, was seen as very problematic by a lot of folks, and including the task force, and so that was changed to information has value, and it was given a little bit of a broader scope. And but that's what we came up with. The Delphi study was commodity. So I do think that I do actually think that there are other threshold concepts out there. One of which was introduced to the task force, the information is a human right, which I actually think is a threshold concept, but the task force didn't pick it up, and it was never brought up in the Delphi study. So the Delphi study just came up with its own results, and we just moderated that. So you know, we weren't really necessarily giving our own thoughts in that process. So they're a little different, but we in the task force used results from a very early round of the Delphi study to just start thinking about this stuff. They didn't actually use the Delphi study necessarily and the results, and that's going to be published very soon, the beginning of next year, in Communications and Information Literacy.
And so, sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble separating out the conversation happening in the chat box, but I think someone asked if we would share our activities, and the answer is yes. So we'll be posting these slides on our website following the end of this presentation, and on our website you should also see some examples of assignments. And then I'm going to take a little bit of a cop-out and say that the full list of assignments that we've developed to use in our classrooms will be forthcoming in a monograph 2017.
Oh, I see someone saying, how does one grade such a concept? That's an interesting question. I think that that's what I was a little bit trying to get at in the section about assessment, which is that you can't grade maybe the concept, but you can set up learning objectives like we normally do for what we teach, and you know, grade those, you know, with rubrics and the usual way that we, depending on what you're doing and if it's for a credit course or that kind of thing. But I think that the concepts are more acting as guidelines for sort of reassessing the content that we teach. That's how I've always viewed it, but then I don't know, there's different opinions out there about that, I think.
And the other point of clarification I think that may be helpful is that threshold concepts are not learning objectives. So you have the idea, like research as a process, and then you might write learning objectives that say students will be able to identify a research question that is within the scope of the class content. I don't know. That's a really bad learning objective. Let's not use that one. But they are not the same thing. The other piece there is, as I'm sharing activities, I always want to be really careful to clarify that there's a difference between pedagogical practice and the concept itself. The threshold concepts have to do with content and not with the way we teach. It's what we teach, it's not the way we teach. So you'll see in my examples that maybe prioritize active learning or inquiry-based learning, and those particular activities respond to structures within the classroom that may help students be more connected, build a community, get along with each other, really feel engaged with the content. But ultimately, threshold concept as a theory is used to define what we're teaching, and all of the other stuff reflects just my priority as a teacher and not necessarily something that's tied to the threshold concept theory.
And I would also say that I think that because we're talking about trying to push on what we teach a little bit, trying to acknowledge that a lot of what we teach is complex and that it can't be easily communicated in a one-shot. If we are sort of admitting that, and for me that was actually the biggest takeaway for Threshold Concepts, was this idea that no, my students just it's not just that they're not paying attention or that I'm a really, really terrible teacher. It's that this stuff is actually complex. And I think complex ideas require a shift in teaching methods sometimes. And I think that it requires us to do more, and I know that folks have been doing more than point and click, but it requires us to ask for more from our students. And I think part of what Sylvia was sharing with her activities, like concept mapping and writing, is that it gives the student a chance to give you more than, say, like a multiple choice test would, or that kind of thing. So I think that because these ideas that we're trying to communicate, that we're trying to help students move through are complex, we have to sort of up our teaching game a little bit and engage at a different kind of level. At least that's how it worked for me. And I first encountered these in the context of a credit course. So I was with the students for a quarter and trying to teach them some of these ideas around research, and I wasn't experiencing a huge amount of success sometimes. And so this is what was sort of helping me rethink about what I was teaching. And it did impact how I taught, even if, again, I agree with Sylvia that those are separate things. Threshold concepts are about what we're teaching, not necessarily about how.
Okay, I'm going to read this question from Paul. It says, Lori and Sylvia, you defend TCs as being about big ideas. What is the difference between TCs and core concepts, or just general main items to know? I know TCs are more specifically meant to be transformative, bounded, and reversible. Why do you think we need to focus on big ideas that have all or most of these qualities rather than all big ideas that students should learn?
Well, I think that those qualities are the ones that Meyer and Land are using to help identify things that are particularly difficult for students and that may cause them to get stuck. That whole sense of troublesome knowledge, that sense of tacit knowledge, stuff that maybe is not explicitly laid out in a curriculum and that we have to dig a little bit deeper to get to. So I think that the main reason why, particularly to focus on there's the transformative, the bounded, the irreversible, but there's also that sense of these are integrative. Hopefully they're going to help bring together some of the other just big ideas, main concepts like you're talking about that are in the curriculum. And then also the students may get stuck if we're not looking at these, and they may just kind of stop hearing us. Sylvia?
Yeah, I think that's a complicated question because I don't see it as a one or the other. We tie it to a lot of other related theories, both within and outside of information literacy, because we see threshold concepts as a theory that fits into the continuum of ongoing explorations into the most effective and productive pedagogy. And so to say that threshold concepts necessarily must be above or beyond this idea of big ideas isn't necessarily, for me, the more useful way of looking at it. It's more so like when I think about Meyer and Land's theory in the context of Klosau, or in the context of even the blended librarian or any other ideas that aim at helping us be better teachers, this is one theory that I've found to be most helpful for me. And so, yes, big ideas are important, and yes, core concepts are important, but there is something about looking at the criteria and looking at the affective, what is the emotional impact on the student, what is the function of lingering in that liminal space where you sort of get something but don't quite get something. There's a lot of pieces to the theory that I find unusual and difficult and challenging, and it's in sorting out those complications and contradictions that I've found myself improving my teaching and improving my content. And so we bring up things like big ideas or core concepts, or we bring in other related pedagogical theories to help us see threshold concepts as a part of what has always been an effort to improve the application of theory to our practice.
So are there any other questions? It's hard for me, just chat is in like this little tiny thing, and I don't know how to make it bigger, so I'm having a hard time going back through it. For me, I'm actually a terrible assignment creator. I'm terribly uncreative. So a lot of the things that when folks ask for posting of assignments, most of the stuff that we use here, other folks develop, or I take something that somebody else did and I modify it. My favorite assignments for classes tend to be, here, read this, let's have a discussion, let's do some writing, let's answer these questions. I think that the most useful bit for me personally when I talk to Sylvia about what she does is the list of questions that she asks students, because she's really good at asking questions. Right. I think that's a really good comment from, is that Raquel? About Rachel, Raquel, that sense of like realizing that this is this gap and trying to bridge that gap, and maybe that we can't bridge it with a simple 4-step process that's going to take a student from here to there. And I agree that the expert novice divide is a little problematic. I think that it's a useful way to think about things, and I tend to think of most of threshold concepts and all of these other theories as conceptual tools, and so I'll use it while it's useful and I'll discard it when I feel like it's not being helpful. And I find the expert novice divide to be helpful most of the time. Occasionally it can become a stumbling block, but I do think that this is just acknowledging the complexity with what we teach.
So I wanted to respond a little bit to Molly, who says that librarians want to wrestle with these ideas, but faculty members may not. So I will mention that in most of my examples, those are born out of the same request emails that I'm sure all librarians get from their faculty. So an English faculty member says, we have a pro-con assignment, or they say, we are doing primary versus secondary sources, there you have to use one of each in their paper. And then I think about that request and build an assignment around their request. So when they walk into that classroom, the students are still getting exactly what they asked for. Typically in those early level English classes, we get something like they want to know the difference between popular and scholarly sources. They need to narrow down their topics. They need to find 3 to 5 academic peer-reviewed journal articles. Great. So I start from there, and I always give the faculty what they want. And each one of those examples I showed you take between 15 to maximum 20 minutes to complete from start to finish, leaving a wonderful 30-minute ball of time where I do demonstrate a database and then work with students one-on-one. So from the perspective of the faculty, what they've asked for and what is being delivered are the same as they were before, but it's a lot of fun for me to put together, and I do believe that this way of approaching those requests does result in a more engaged classroom and students who take away a broader understanding of what's happening when they click somewhere.
And I would also say that if you want to engage with faculty, the first group that would probably be very supportive is your writing faculty. The writing faculty, when I took threshold concepts to them, they said, oh, are you using threshold concepts too? There are very few books about threshold concepts, but one of the first ones that's been published is one of writing. So, and they're working with a similar problem that we are with their writing across the curriculum and trying to work with different faculty from different disciplines to get them to engage with writing and students with writing. So, and I think that's very similar to information literacy. So I think we're coming up on time.
But Sarah, if you could elaborate on what you mean by problematic assignments, are those problematic assignments from the faculty?
Oh.
Oh, and to tack on to what Lori just said, I believe there's also a new book looking at threshold concepts for women's studies, which was really useful because women's studies, like information science, is multi and interdisciplinary. Mm-hmm. So if a faculty member has an assignment that does not include information literacy skills, so when a faculty member comes up with a really problematic assignment, so say for instance, it's the public speaking 101 class that a faculty member says they have to talk about their career. And this actually, I think, is one of Lori's curriculum mapping examples as well. And so there isn't necessarily a information science component, but I think that that's where you have a unique opportunity to build in some of the ideas related to the framework. Because part of what is compelling is thinking about the information universe with the library website decentered. So we're not using the library website as the be-all, end-all portal for information, right? And so when you have a topic like career, that's a great opportunity to look at salary.com and compare it to the Occupational Outlook Handbook and talk about why, say, the projected salaries are different in those two locations, talk about the difference between advertising or job listing versus what might be produced by the U.S. government versus, say, something like Ferguson's Career Center, a database the library pays for, and looking at those different kinds of information being produced by a commercial library paid for by the library, a commercial website that's generating ad content, or a government website. And so what the faculty member is asking for is do career research so that they can do a speech. You're still fulfilling that need, but you're going into questions about format and authority and maybe even information commodities in a way that does tie in the framework and, for us, threshold concepts.
Well, I think that's it. Thank you. And, Miranda, are you?
Thanks for being here.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone, so much for joining us today. Please join me in thanking Sylvia and Lori for their time, their expertise. You guys are really, truly amazing. The work you've done has really moved our profession forward, and I'm just so grateful. I can't thank you enough for sharing that with us today. Please watch for the link to this recorded webinar on the WordPress site for Framework for Information Literacy. That is acrl.ala.org/framework. It will be up later this week. Thank you guys so much.
Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye, everyone. Have a good rest of your week.